Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, conversations with the people trying to save us from ourselves. In today's meandering interview, I spoke with Art Lapinsch. A tech founder by background, Art has become obsessed in the last year and a half with energy policy and gone deep down that rabbit hole, where he's found that energy policy is actually everything policy. We talked about that, as well as the geographical hotspots for ClimateTech and his series of thought pieces called Delphi Zero. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for joining. Art, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, man.
So you're a successful exited founder who's worked in a few different industries, mostly in tech, but ranging from HR to fintech to ad tech. And now you're focused largely or exclusively on climate tech. You're also a war refugee. And these days you're studying energy law. So you cover a lot of ground in your personal and professional life. Can you take us through your background a little bit? How you got where you are? We're talking in Athens, but you're also based in Berlin. So where you are both thematically, but also physically, if you'd like.
Yeah, for sure. I'll give you the bullet point version. And then if there's something interesting, we can dive a little bit deeper. So I was born in the Soviet Union. My mom is Russian. My dad is Latvian. And they left, let's say, the sinking ship before the empire collapsed. They moved with me as a baby to Yugoslavia. We settled in a town called Mostar, which some people would describe as the Jerusalem of Yugoslavia because you had the three different religions there. But unfortunately, one and a half years later, the civil war was knocking at the front door, and we also had to leave Mostar. Got super lucky, got airlifted out by a military machine, first to Belgrade, and then my dad, who's a musician, he scored a weekend gig back in Vienna. And that was at a time when visas were given out for 6 months. So my mom decided to come along and just see what Vienna, Austria is all about for a weekend. The weekends turned into 6 months, 6 months turns into a lifetime. And then that's how I ended up being a Austrian citizen. So I'm pretty much since the age of 2.5, lived in Vienna, grown up there, did my studies first in business and then in advertising in London and Paris. And the way I got into entrepreneurship was by pure coincidence. So picking where to study, I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And kind of being a very uncreative person, I thought, well, there's only business, medicine, or law. And I said, law, probably too dry. Well, came full circle. So now I'm studying law. Medicine, I just somehow couldn't imagine myself working every single day in a hospital or a private practice environment. And so this left business. I started studying, had a bunch of my homies from high school who were also at the same university. And initially, since everyone was going into consulting, I also wanted to go into consulting. So I saw an ad for ADL, Arthur D. Little, and applied for one of their assessment centers. They rejected me, and I was that was the moment I was done with consulting. So kind of lucky in hindsight. And I was still looking for some sort of student job and found that there was a position at one of the institutes, which was the Entrepreneurship Institute, as a student assistant. So it's pretty much setting up tables, bringing out pizza and Coca-Cola when entrepreneurs would come visit once a week and talk about their experience to a set of students. And this is what got me hooked. Every single week, I could see people who didn't hate their jobs, didn't hate what they were doing on a regular basis. And I got my first real job through chatting up one of those entrepreneurs. And it was like a student organization which was trying to teach entrepreneurial principles to students. So it was like a ripoff of Startup Live. Startup Weekends, which was like the format where, a bunch of people come together over a weekend. They discuss their ideas, work on them for 2 or 3 days, and then pitch in front of some sort of investors. And so this was my first connection point with entrepreneurship. So I was organizing these type of events in Austria, but also Europe-wide for a couple of years. And then I moved to Berlin to join a venture builder. So venture builder, pretty much just like a venture fund that has a thematic focus. So in that particular case, it was ad tech, advertising technology, and they were starting multiple businesses every single year. And my position initially was just I was like a plumber. I would have to do everything. So like build slide decks for the CEO, jump into a fox costume for the corporate photo shoots because the company was called HitFox. And I was the junior most employee. And through that, I got the opportunity to move for this venture builder to San Francisco, which wasn't in the cards at all. So initially, I had the idea of moving to Asia after finishing my studies, because my thinking was, well, highest economic growth, if you experience that in one region, you can probably apply some of the learnings in new developing regions. And this venture builder, they had an office in Seoul, South Korea. So I said, hey, boss, I want to move to South Korea. And they talked with the managing director of that office. And he said, well, it's a sales office, so you don't speak any Korean, no dice. But we have this opportunity in San Francisco. I've never been into the West Coast in my life. And my decision took, I don't know, a split second. So when they said, there's this opportunity in San Francisco, I immediately said yes, without even knowing what I got myself into. But probably one of the most consequential decisions of my life. So moved to San Francisco, drank the Silicon Valley Kool-Aid, was starting a couple of ads tech and fintech businesses for that venture builder in the US, and then left the venture builder to start my own business with a couple of other people. And so we started also an advertising software company that would help businesses such as Lyft, UPS, DHL to recruit drivers automatically. So it's like high volume recruitment automation. Did that for a couple of years, got lucky with the timing, and the company got acquired by one of the largest recruitment marketing agencies in the world. Spent 2 years there on integration and as an executive for the European business unit, and then took a sabbatical. So that's kind of like the short version of it. And yeah, we can go into more detail if you want.
And okay. And so what brings you to Athens right now?
Athens, well, that's just like a personal decision. So we've been and we're still living in Berlin primarily with my girlfriend, but we were just interested in exploring new cities, visited two of our friends who moved from Berlin to Athens in 2019, fell in love with the city immediately. So we had one of these moments where you have this, holy shit, this place is amazing realization. And in my life, I had this only with a couple of cities. In Europe, it was Berlin, Lisbon, and Athens. And then we started looking at the real estate market and saw that it's much more attractive to get a place here, and much more affordable to get a place here than in Berlin. And the rest is history.
Yeah, I lived in Berlin for quite a while and was involved in the startup world there. I left about a year and a half ago. And of course, Berlin's the first city that comes to mind when people think of, I mean, also ClimateTech right now, it's picked up quite a bit, but it's becoming increasingly challenging on the housing front. I read a stat about a year and a half ago that Immobilien Scout, which is the main kind of platform for apartments, for every available apartment for rent in central Berlin, they get 72 applications. So not just visits or anything like that, but applications. And so I think that in the end, it's going to affect the startup environment because it's going to be hard for companies to scale. The city's under a lot of stress. And I'm very curious. The Vienna Business Agency had me on a webinar recently talking about, my reasons for moving here. And I talked a little bit about that kind of strain that's happening in some of the other places. Also in Lisbon, right? Lisbon was a really, really hot place and still is, for digital nomads, for kind of the crypto space as well. But they're having a similar kind of housing crisis. And I'm wondering, just, this is a bit of a side question, but what are your thoughts on kind of the next hotspots for tech clusters and potentially specifically climate tech clusters in Europe?
Tech clusters, the biggest trend is probably the distribution of talent, or just let's say like that. Before COVID, most businesses said remote cannot be done, especially at large scales of an organization. Our business that we built and that we started in 2015 was remote first, mainly because we couldn't afford to hire engineers in San Francisco. And we had to rely on former colleagues who were based out of, let's say, southwestern Germany because they had families and their kids were in school. And I still remember in 2015 when I was telling my friends, hey, I work from home, immediately assumed that I'm unemployed. So, latest by, let's say, April 2020, when the realization hit even for large companies, this can be done. It's mainly just a organizational culture issue that opens up the possibility to hire people everywhere on the planet. I mean, especially you have more infrastructure providers such as remote.com or deal.com that even allow you to hire people in a different country while being in compliance with local law. So it just makes it much more attractive to have like an international pool of talent. So I think the major hubs that we know will kind of like remain: San Francisco, New York, Berlin, London, yada, yada, yada. But you'll have more businesses that are just distributed by default. And I would say this is the trend for general tech. For climate tech, maybe a little bit different. I haven't thought about that in so much detail, but what I see a lot is that for climate, you don't only deal with software, but very frequently with the physical realm. You're building products, you're building generation capacity, you have to deal with local laws, and that helps, or like it's beneficial for an organization to have a finger on the pulse where you want to be in the market. So kind of like if you want to solve, let's say, some Greek specific problem in energy and in climate, then most likely you'll have to set up shop in Greece. You might have some of your talent work remotely, specifically on the software components and maybe the, let's say, business administrational components, but some fraction of the business will have to be in the spaces. And so my guess would be that you will have a lot of localized hubs, and pretty much every country will have one or two hubs that probably are closer to the research institutions and the main technical universities of that particular country. That would be my guess.
Interesting. So there could be kind of micro hubs where, in the countries that they're present, but the overall leadership or the team might be more distributed. So seeing these different kind of variations of the hybrid model going forward. So you're an entrepreneur through and through. You've worn the Fox outfit and you've set up the pizza tables and done your time in the Valley. And in the last year and a half, you've really gone down the rabbit hole on climate tech, but especially on things like energy policy, energy storage. As an entrepreneur, you must see lots of opportunities everywhere. What kind of opportunities catch your interest the most right now?
$1 million question, $1 billion question.
The gigaton question.
The gigaton question. Yeah. So one thing, it's one reason why it's difficult to answer that with one sentence is energy and climate touches pretty much every single aspect of our economy. I think that's something that I've read in a newsletter by Nan Rensahov, who runs Stripe Climates. And it was like a piece specifically about why it is so difficult to transition your career into climate, because like once you start reading about it, you notice, oh, I have to know about energy. If I have to know about energy, I have to know about the physics and maybe the chemistry of energy, then production processes. Then you start getting into permitting cycles and local policies and laws. Then you get into consumer preferences, consumer patterns. And so it just literally touches the entire world economy. I like to say, compared to the climate opportunity, Amazon.com is like a lemonade stand. Because if you think about it, if we believe that climate change is real and that it's caused by emitting greenhouse gases, and that if we also believe that our chance for survival are higher if we go to net zero, and if this is like a desired outcome, then you pretty much have to substitute the entire global economy that is currently in place, either through decarbonized solutions or completely new solutions. And that doesn't matter whether you're a service provider or if you are manufacturing, let's say, clothes, cars, or if you are generating electricity. So opportunities are everywhere. So that's like why it's so difficult for me to answer. One of the things that I'm pretty interested in is energy storage, but probably we'll talk about that a little bit later as well.
a lot of people in the industry talk about how the term itself, climate tech, is going to become, if it's not already, very obsolete because, as you say, it's about just transforming the entire world, basically. And so in the same way that, in the year 2000, you might talk about having an internet company, today it's such a meaningless term, right? Because you would say, okay, well, what does it do? That's sort of just the platform. And I see a lot of kind of parallels there. But in this rabbit hole, you've come up with, or you've put together a Substack called Delphi Zero, and you've published 13 essays, 4 sci-fi stories, and an interview. And I have to say, I'll link the Substack in the show notes, and I really encourage listeners to check it out. You have this fine balance of kind of going really deep and nerding out on some of these specific topics and subtopics, but I also found myself literally laughing out loud at a few of them. So you're able to weave in really effectively storytelling and humor into it, which is definitely not common so far in this sector. Why did you come up with the idea to create this Substack? Substack's basically a platform for posting essays and writings. Why did you come up with the idea for this? It reads almost at the beginning to me like a bit of a journal that you then started making outwardly focused. Is that getting warm?
Yeah. So in my previous company, I ran business operations, and one of the aspects in there was also marketing and just in general knowledge transfer within the employee base, but also within the customer base. And one of the things that companies struggle with, especially let's say traditional companies that move from in-person communication to remote communication, is you have these questions that are being asked over and over again, just kind of evergreen questions, but that you answer by verbally communicating. In an office, it's very cheap. You turn around, you tap someone on the shoulder and it's like, hey, how do we do this? They answer, you turn around. In a remote environment, you would have to set up a meeting, go on a call, and then answer the question. Then if multiple people have the same question, you are just in endless meetings nonstop. One of the best ways to solve for this problem is like whenever you have a question that keeps getting asked frequently and where the information remains stable, it's like a solid state piece of information, you can document it, regardless if you make a video or you make a written documentation, a wiki, a blog entry, whatever. Writing is my love language. That's like how I describe it. I gravitate more towards long form writing. My absolute hero is Tim Urban from Wait But Why, and really fell in love with this type of style of communication of complex concepts such as artificial intelligence, how to find a partner for life, how to cryogenically freeze your brain so you can live forever. Like all of those crazy things, this guy manages to explain in blog posts that are almost the length of a short book. And he does it by looking at the big picture, breaking it down into like all the subcomponents, going very deep into all these subcomponents, while doing so, working with analogies and stories that are easy to remember or just like easy to grasp compared to very technical language. And he's humorous. And so you are entertained while you learn. And by the end of it, you've learned about all these separate buckets and he brings it back together into the big picture. And so this is my golden standard for communicating, let's say, technical knowledge. We tried to work with such an approach in my previous company by publishing blog posts. And the cool thing was, by doing it and by writing those, we understood the concepts much better because we had a language how to communicate it to, let's say, ourselves, but also to customers. B, we had a shareable asset that you could send either to your own employees or to customers when they have questions, so you save time. And thirdly, it's almost like a proof of work. So you put something out, people can interact with it, and if they really like it, they reach out to you. So it's a possibility of meeting interesting people, like similar to you, right? Like I don't think that without the blog, you would have had as much context about what I'm doing, like how I'm thinking. And so it's nice just to share a little bit about yourself. So why did I start the Substack? Exactly for those reasons. And also early last year, I decided that I wanted to spend significant amount of my time, like next years of my career, in the space of energy, climate, and kind of like security policy. And I have to get up to speed anyway. And while I do that, I can just write my own summaries, but also make them public. And so this is what the Substack is. I just, try to convey the information in a not boring way.
It's interesting that you answer that by looking at kind of the example of internal at a company, because I've noticed this a lot, both at large companies through to startups, is that they tend to focus a lot on communication and communication tools and storage tools. So if you look at most companies right now, if you look at any startup right now, they'll have Slack and Google Drive or something like that, but they won't have knowledge management kind of in the middle there, like Notion or a tool like that. What I found with the companies that I've run is to bring in that kind of middleware where and it's almost like blog articles, or it's like, how do we do a webinar, or how do we do something, right? And it's, you can connect it to the storage and to the communication, but to just kind of have like this single source of truth of how you do something, or how you think about something. And then it does become both an internal and an external thing. And it actually ends up building the culture, and it creates this kind of sense of that you're building on something, right? And not just starting from scratch every single time, which has nothing but kind of, virtuous cycle effects within the organization.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who said it, but there's like this idea of there are two things that are very scalable. One is code and the other one is media. And scaling media is pretty much like scaling ideas. It's just putting some sort of insight or just like light bulb moment from your head into multiple people's heads. And specifically in the context of climate, very frequently, it's just people might have all the information, but it somehow doesn't trigger internal change. They don't get changed as a person to care about it. And I feel this is like one of the main challenges, and maybe like the one challenge that I'll try to focus on in the coming years, is how to translate all the magical stuff, like all the technology, all the projects, all the ambition that is going on in the climate space, and just making it palatable for people like myself who don't have a PhD in mechanical engineering, but are still excited about crazy cool technology. So
one of the things you talk about is that people don't feel a connection to energy, but they feel a connection to driving their car, or to being cool in the summer, or to having an oven that works and that type of thing. So they think in terms of the application. And if you talk about energy just as this broad kind of concept, you just lose people. People don't feel connected to it.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something, and by no means have I figured this out or anything, but I find myself in these situations, maybe like you too, because you're also working in climate. People sometimes at parties who don't know me, they just like ask, what do you do? And I can see the life drain out of them within 4 seconds and like see the glassy eyes. When you start talking about energy, it's like one of those topics. I tried to explain it to my girlfriend today. I think one of the issues is you need so many layers of context to fully grasp what's going on. So that makes it very, very difficult to communicate it in a very quick way. And if you say, well, I'm working so that the next generations of your lineage have a planet to live, I mean, it's a hyperbole, maybe. And maybe this triggers interest, and maybe they say, oh, how do you do that? And then you can start drilling deeper. Maybe that's a way of trying to communicate what you do. But yeah, a bunch of people work in energy, whether it is on the commercial side, on the technical side, and all of that is so necessary. But if you just explain what you do, you lose people so quickly.
And you have the advantage of not just saying energy, but energy, law, and markets, which compounds it even more.
Yeah.
But so the timing, you got really interested in this around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and to a large extent because of these energy security markets, the interrelation of all of this kind of stuff. In the last year and a half looking into this, what are some of the things that have surprised you or that you found really interesting?
Good question. Before the beginning of the war, I didn't really read too much about energy, climate, or policy at all. I thought that policy is the most boring thing on the planet, and energy and climate was very technical, and somehow I just couldn't develop an interest for that. And I was more interested in indie hacking, creating no-code websites. just yeah, smaller stuff, which is also fine, but I didn't really think that much about energy. So then with the beginning of the war, for personal reasons, it hit really close to home. My mom has business for many decades now in Ukraine, in the region of Zaporizhia, which is maybe known through the news due to its like nuclear power plant and Enerhodar. And so it felt super shit, to be honest. I was like, frustration, crying, everything. And a good friend of mine said, maybe there's like a way how to use this energy that you have to do something about it, which makes sense. And I think that was like the right snap out of it recommendation that I needed. So I just didn't know like where to begin. It was like so complex and what to do. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was like start reading about it and going down the like Twitter rabbit hole of the updates. And I ended up, I don't know, through algorithm or interest, but I ended up reading a lot about security analysis, mainly on the military side, and then ended up reading a lot about the interconnection between like military and policy. Kind of makes sense. And there is this quote, like war is the continuation of policy, or like politics if you don't have other means. Yeah. Or by other means, exactly. And then if you remember early on in the war, like as a taxpayer and resident of Germany, I was asking myself why the policy response, or at least the public policy response from the German government, was so muted compared to other countries. What's to do relative to Russia? And one of the arguments was, well, Germany has a very high imports share of its fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, coming from Russia. What is the gas used for? It's primarily industrial applications. And so like if you would turn off the imports immediately, would have a huge economic impact on Germany, on its citizens, political stability, and so on. So this was the first aha moment where I saw, well, energy and security policy is heavily intertwined. Policy is pretty much just like energy policy and vice versa. And at the same time, energy policy also plays a huge impact in like climate, specifically as to like how did we get here? And more interestingly, like how do we get out of it? So my first insight was, well, policy is pretty much a question about A, what are we trying to do for the future? Like what are the policy objectives? And B, how do we try to achieve these objectives? Policy instruments. And non-fancy word for policy instrument is laws. So you draft up a piece of writing that says you can do this, you cannot do that, permissions, prohibitions, and then you run it by parliaments. They say yay or nay. And then if it goes into action, you suddenly have a rule change for the system in which everyone else plays, every citizen, every business, and so on. So very powerful. You have the possibility to change the rules. So that was like insight number one. Second thing that was surprising was if you assume that policymakers have this unfair advantage, they can come up with the rules at any point in time when they want, is like, well, why don't they put up rules in place that set us up for net zero immediately? Why don't they just like ban fossil fuels starting tomorrow? And so there's this concept of the energy trilemma. And I think that really describes pretty well what's going on, like the challenges that policymakers have to face. The energy trilemma is pretty much saying you have three objectives. A, it has to be good for the environment. So you're looking at the climate. Is it good for, let's say, future generations and so on, sustainability? Second objective is it economical? So is it affordable? Is it cheaper than current alternatives? Like thinking along these lines, along business and kind of like financial matters. And the third objective is political stability and security, national security, energy security. The problem is, and that's like why it's called the trilemma, is because if you favor one over the other two, usually the other two, or at least one of them, will suffer. I'll give you an example. If we say it's 1990 and we know by now burning fossil fuels is bad for the environment. And we know that installing solar panels is really good for the environment. Well, let's draft up a law that mandates 100% of electricity coming from solar panels. But back in 1990, it was so expensive that you just could not afford it, even with your entire GDP, to just like replace the entire generation capacity from fossil fuels to electricity. And B, because you couldn't afford it, or maybe because you couldn't even produce it and install it in time, suddenly you wouldn't have electricity. And that means you don't have energy security. Your citizens literally cannot tap water from the faucet. And if that happens, wait 24 hours, wait 48 hours, and you'll see what happens on the streets. So it's not as simple for policymakers to say, starting tomorrow, we have to change everything. And so like once you have this trilemma in mind, I think just gives a little bit more context of what's going on.
And in Germany, this is because all of the Russian gas that's coming through the Nord Stream pipeline and the complete dependence on there. So that's why there is a slower response basically there relative to some of the other countries. I like that you said that you got into this either out of interest or algorithm, which I think captures our times quite well. I mean, I don't even know if I was interested in it myself, but Twitter seemed to think that I was.
Yeah.
And so the prognosis for the future of energy now is rising demand, hopefully the decarbonization of the grid, or just attempts at this at least, and an increase on grid security. And I would say both in the physical sense, but also in, terms of ransomware and things like this, which are becoming more and more problematic. And you hold that the lowest common denominator across all three of these trends is storage. So this is an area that you've kind of, you've gone through the rabbit hole of the rabbit hole into. Why is that?
Well, so I'm currently researching for like my thesis project, the business of energy storage. And so one thing in particular is like, what are the current limitations of the energy law and what are current, let's say, opportunities and arbitrage opportunities in it? The way I arrived at the topic of energy storage, as you mentioned, these three mega trends. Like the first one is electrification of everything. Yeah? So if we assume that on a high level, we believe that there's going to be more electricity demand in the future. So there are certain estimates that say what we're consuming today, we have to add at least 50% of that over the next 30 years. Yeah? We assume that. And we like, why is that specifically? Is like, think of your household, maybe you're heating with a gas boiler. So like in winter, to stay warm, you're burning gas to stay warm. Maybe in the US, if you're cooking something on a stove, it's a gas stove. And then like the way you commute is like you take a bus, you take a car, and it's powered by gasoline. So like all of these three can be electrified with heat pumps, induction stoves, and EV cars. And that will require a lot more electricity. Let's say just thinking of the current energy consumers, but don't forget that there is a lot of countries in Asia, such as China, India, Indonesia, and so on, where a large chunk of the population, millions and millions, even billions of people are increasing their living standards. And they also want to live well. They want to have AC in their homes, especially in those regions. So more electricity needed. Number two, the grid has to be decarbonized. So currently, look, if you look at the total global emissions, like roughly 40% of all global emissions come from generating electricity. Crazy amount. And so this is because electricity is generated by burning coal, by burning gas. Yeah, those are like, let's say, the biggest emitters. And if we want to transition to renewable energy, that means we need to install a lot of solar photovoltaic panels. We need a lot of windmills, either onshore or offshore. And it has to be installed. And there are some challenges with that. So first of all, typical example that everyone gives is this beautiful German word called Dunkelflaute. Dunkel means dark. Flaute means if there's no wind going. So imagine a scenario where at night, no wind, meaning you don't have any electricity generation capacity from solar or wind. What do? People still need electricity to run the traffic lights, to run the critical systems in a hospital, right? And this challenge is called intermittency. So renewables have this issue that at times they generate a lot, and at times they don't generate anything at all. And that's a big issue. And then the third one, focus on security, as you mentioned. If electricity is becoming more important, just think of exactly what happened with Germany and gas, where suddenly they didn't have supply from from gas from Russia. The storage tanks didn't hold any gas, and suddenly Germany was in a pickle. So the same might be true for electricity in the future. And so I would say energy storage, specifically electricity storage, can solve the first problem because electricity storage can be a substitute to generation. The consumer doesn't care if they plug in their iPhone, whether the electrons are currently being generated somewhere in a wind farm, or if it's just coming from a battery. Doesn't
or if it's coming from your Tesla in your garage.
Exactly. Then secondly, storage can help with those intermittency issues, because if wind and solar is generating so much electricity that, last weekend was a great example. Germany had negative electricity prices for an entire day because there's so much electricity generation capacity that, prices went negative. And so in those instances, instead of shutting down the solar panels and the windmills, wouldn't it be amazing if we can just take these electrons and store them away in a battery or some sort of other type of storage facility to use it when you have these Dunkelflaute moments when no renewable energy can be or electricity can be generated. And then lastly, I think if you have storage facilities of a certain size, then this gives you, let's say, strategic reinsurance if someone attacks your grid. And say every household has, for example, an EV battery. Well, let's use the electricity from that EV battery for the next 24 hours to tap our water and not rely on the central grid. But it's a pretty interesting field. And I think energy storage just checks a lot of boxes from a commercial perspective. What's really interesting is that you can be really creative with business models. You can offer the stored electricity to end consumers. You can offer the electricity to industrial and commercial consumers, but you can also offer the electricity to the grid providers, the infrastructure providers, and that's called flexibility services. So a lot of interesting aspects from a commercial perspective, and I think it'll just grow in importance.
And once upon a time, the thinking of storage for electricity was about having dedicated batteries to storing that, that surplus of electricity. But these days, as we're electrifying other things, especially transportation, we can look at dual purpose batteries. So like the electric car in your garage that serves as a power plant also when energy is needed and not at kind of a surplus.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the obvious questions is well, if electricity storage is so important, why don't we have it yet? I think can be also explained with the energy trilemma, right? In the past, it was really expensive, prohibitively expensive to store electricity, specifically renewable electricity, that it didn't make sense. But now, through the European energy crisis, with gas prices going up, with more renewable electricity generation capacity coming online, we're seeing for the first time that these price curves have intersected and are going different directions. So fossil fuels are becoming more expensive on average. Renewables are becoming cheaper at an increasing rate. And so now the question is we can generate renewable electricity. We can store it. Now, what are the different technologies we can use to tap this excess electricity, and how can we store it in a cost competitive way?
Yeah, the good thing about renewables is that the feedstock is almost always free.
Yeah, there's a fantastic quote by Namez Ram. He said the good thing with renewables is that it's not a commodity, but it's a technology. Because the feedstock, you don't have to mine it, right? It's available, it's renewable. And the cost of the energy that you sell in the market is not dependent on the combination of commodity, example, fossil fuels, gas, plus extraction technology and process, plus refining, plus transportation.
And then still plus CapEx. It's then just
plus
the CapEx. Yeah.
And renewables, it's CapEx plus the generation and the operational costs and transportation, but you don't have the cost of the commodity, which makes a huge chunk. of the price for fossil fuels, which will not go away.
So I'll link to your Substack in the show notes, and I highly recommend that people check them out. And as I say, there's some serious laugh out loud moments in there. Anything else you would suggest that people have a look at? You've done a huge amount of reading in the last couple of years on these topics. Anything else you'd like to suggest? A website, a book, anything, a pamphlet?
Depends on what you're interested in, like what your knowledge level is already. So one interview that was really helpful to me was on a Substack called No Opinion by the writer Noah Smith. He does a lot of economics, writing essays, interviews, and so on. And he had an interview guest called Ramez Nam, who is an investor, futurist, also science fiction writer, has an amazing trilogy called the Nexus Trilogy. I can highly recommend it. But they talk about the connection between why renewable energy is getting cheaper. So they talk about learning curves. They talk about the impact of the Russian invasion in Ukraine on the general energy landscape and a couple of other predictions for the future. So this is a good starting point. Other than that, really depends where your interest takes you. I have a collection of links on my personal website. I can send you the link afterwards, but it's artlapinsch.com/climate. And there I usually just store all the stuff, which I think other people might benefit from reading.
Art, thanks a lot.
Thanks, man.
How cool. You made it all the way to the end. Why not go one step further and subscribe, rate, and share this podcast? Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now.